evening, everyone. My name is Sereka Barlow. I am the CEO for Ywca El Paso del Norte region, and you are here for our third courageous conversation of this wonderful 2023. And it is a topic that I'm very interested in learning a lot about, and we have a panel of experienced guests. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your afternoon. And what I'm going to do now is to turn it over to our lovely Dr. Ann Horak, who is an associate professor of practice out of UTEP. She has published many papers. She is on a number of committees with UTEP, and she is a fantastic member serving YWCA, not only as a local board member, but as a board member for YWCA USA. So Ann, if you would please take it over.
Thank you, Sereka. And Sereka is CEO of YWCA El Paso, and we are so appreciative of her bringing this forward, this opportunity for us to talk about anti-Semitism and hate against the Jewish community, a topic which sadly continues to be relevant as we see more and more of these types of events. But I want to introduce our panelists to you tonight, and then I'm going to have each one of them share about the organizations that they represent. So we have Jamie Flores, who is the executive director of the El Paso Holocaust Museum and Study Center. Jamie has been recognized for her work in Holocaust education, and she has served us before on a YWCA Courageous Conversation. And you can see a past archive of our Courageous Conversations on the YWCA homepage. On a courageous conversation that we did around racism and racial justice. So thank you. Glad to have you back, Jamie. We also have Rabbi Ben Zeidman, who is the rabbi of Temple Mount Sinai here in El Paso. And Rabbi Zeidman himself has participated in programs nationwide on education around social justice in the Jewish community. He also works locally, not just with the Jewish community, but with interfaith groups who are committed to education and to social justice. And finally, we have Peter Svarzbein, who many of you probably recognize from serving on our city council and serving as our mayor pro tem. And Peter is now the Anti-Defamation League coordinator, engagement manager for the community for the Southwest region. It is also Peter's birthday. So let's all give him a round of applause, everybody at home, a round of applause, and happy birthday to Peter, who is selflessly spending at least this hour or so of his birthday evening with us. And then afterwards, hopefully he has something, I won't say more fun, but probably more lighthearted than the topic we're going to have tonight. So thank you, all three of you, for being here. I really do appreciate it. Jamie, let me start with you. Tell us about your organization, the Holocaust Museum and Studies Center, and what you all do.
Well, my pleasure to do that. And thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, YWCA, for holding this courageous conversation on such an important topic and inviting me to be a panelist with you all. El Paso Holocaust Museum is really, in my opinion, a gem of the city. We are one of only 13 Holocaust museums in the entire country. We were the first fully bilingual Holocaust museum, and we were founded by a Holocaust survivor, Henry Kellen, over 38 years ago. And our mission at the museum is to teach the history of the Holocaust in order to combat prejudice and intolerance through education, community outreach, and cultural activities. And what this means is that at the heart of everything we do, whether it's tours, outreach, programs, events, is that we teach about the Holocaust and its connection to contemporary issues. We really believe that it is imperative that we learn the lessons from history, not only to memorialize the millions of victims of the Holocaust and the survivors, but also because this history of targeting and persecution, as we'll talk more about tonight, directly connects to current injustices and inhumanity. The history is parallel today with incidents of anti-Semitism, racism, othering, and violence. But the history of the Holocaust, as we teach, also shows what can happen when people choose to stand up and to speak out against hate. The lives that can be saved, the difference that is made when an individual or group acts as upstanders. And so this is really what we do at the museum. We educate, we build connections in our community, and we grow awareness of the relevance of this history to today. We do offer guided tours of the museum. We have outreach presentations to schools, which in total reach about 10,000 students every year. We bring in special exhibits. We have one right now actually called Speaking Up, Confronting Hate Speech, which directly connects to what we're talking about tonight. We also offer teacher trainings and lectures, youth programming like our All People Have Voice series, our summer camp, and much more. And all with the purpose of bringing our mission to our community. And this work and the mission is really, we feel more relevant now than ever, unfortunately. The rise in anti-Semitic incidents and white supremacist activity has skyrocketed in the last few years. And as we'll be talking about tonight, this rise in hate crimes and hate speech affect every single one of us. So as a Holocaust Museum, we feel our mission is more pressing, more urgent than ever to combat this trend with education, awareness, and connections like this event tonight. And we encourage anyone who has not attended the museum or gone on a visit to please come and visit us. We'd love to have you. We'd love to show you more about who we are and what we do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. I appreciate that. And you're right. It is a gem in our city, and we are very fortunate to have a Holocaust museum in our city. Rabbi Zeidman, tell us a little bit about Temple Mount Sinai and about some of the work that you do.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, everybody at the YWCA for hosting this conversation. Couldn't agree with Jamie more. Everybody needs to be sure that they take the time to check out the El Paso Holocaust Museum and stop in to say hi to Jamie. I just want to say that I'm just the rabbi, right? Like I'm a rabbi of Temple Mount Sinai, which is the oldest Jewish congregation here in El Paso. And I am proud to serve our congregation. Its roots go back to the 1880s. It started as a charity organization and to help to create and construct a cemetery for the Jewish community that had made its way to El Paso. And then they realized they probably should, educate their children about what Judaism is. And then they realized they probably should hold worship services every now and again. And in 1898, they formally, formed themselves as a synagogue, as a congregation with a rabbi. I'd like to point out, though, that records of Jews as a part of El Paso go back to at least the 1860s. And unlike a lot of American communities, particularly on the East Coast and in the Midwest, where I've been, Jews have been a part and parcel to the community and its leadership and its supportive organizations all along. We've been a part of the fabric of El Paso society ever since we've been here. Not only in the sense that we've owned businesses or been involved in working and making our way here because the opportunity was here for us on the border, like so many other people. But when I got to El Paso, I learned very quickly that there's this historic sense of responding to the welcome that Jews have historically received by recommitting and involving ourselves in the community more broadly. So you'll see Jews included on lists of the earliest leaders and organizations of El Paso, including the third mayor, Solomon Schutz, in 1880. Was a Jewish community member and a member of the leadership of Temple Mount Sinai when it was founded. But I also love to point out Olga Kohlberg, who helped to create what was called the Ladies Benevolent Society in 1892 here in El Paso. You may not know that organization, but they were the ones who were behind creating the first hospital to be constructed here in El Paso. She also is famous in town for having started the first kindergarten in Texas, which was here in El Paso in 1893. And she's one example that I like to point out, not only because of what she did, which so many other people and women in our community have done for this town, but because many know the name from Kohlberg Elementary on the west side. So this year we're celebrating our 125th anniversary. And Temple Mount Sinai is a place for Jewish people to gather to celebrate our tradition, our heritage, our religion. And I use tradition and heritage and religion in that order on purpose. A lot of people assume that Judaism is a religion just like any other religion that they're familiar with and mostly think of Christianity in this community. But Judaism is more than just a religion and more than just a theology. You don't have to have a specific theological framework to be Jewish. So it's a community gathering space. It's a space for celebration and a space for being comfortable as Jews. I could continue on, but I realize we have a time frame, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you. And I appreciate that history lesson of the importance of the Jewish community here in El Paso. I want to add that in the over 100-year tradition of the YWCA, Jewish women have been absolutely essential, serving on the staff as board members, as board presidents, as donors, as volunteers, as supporters. And there are many other organizations, as you mentioned, Rabbi Zeidman, that
it's a great example, because in most communities, Jews wouldn't have been allowed to be involved in early days with the YWCA, which is why JCCs and other YMHAs were created as well. And just El Paso's kind of cohesiveness in that way is unique and really special and remarkable.
I appreciate that. Yes. Okay. So Peter, somebody who knows El Paso well, served El Paso as an elected official, and now has this new role. I'm guessing that we have a lot of people joining us tonight who might not be familiar with the Anti-Defamation League. And so tell us a little bit about that organization and your work in it.
Absolutely. Thank you again. And thank you for Jamie and Rabbi Zeidman again. It's been an honor being able to be next to you during this conversation. My family is not a family that came into El Paso in the 1880s. In fact, I'm the first in my family to be born in the United States. My father is an immigrant from Latin America. My mother is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. In fact, my grandmother's name is in the Holocaust Museum that Jamie does such a great job in leading. And again, implore everybody to come and visit that important institution as well. I had the opportunity coming out of council to engage in what is really important and I think a necessary work, and that is working with the Anti-Defamation League. And I would like to share you a little bit about what this organization is about. Even though it is my birthday, I can't think of something as important and meaningful as to share with you guys and to be involved in this conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that all right? Great. So again, the Anti-Defamation League essentially is the oldest anti-hate nonprofit in the United States, founded in 1913 to stop the defamation of Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And what we've seen with that, again, is there's a number of different ways that the ADL has gone about doing its very important mission. And want to highlight those right here, right now. So most importantly, again, they investigate, they help to monitor and expose and disrupt extremist threats. They do that through the Center of Extremism, which is based in New York City. They go into the deepest and darkest parts of the web, of the dark web, and monitor and create data about what is going on in real time that we're seeing in terms of extremism. And that we all know that is growing not just against the Jewish community, but other groups as well. They also advocate and work with elected officials for effective policy to fight hate, to fight anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry. And this doesn't make a difference if it's against immigrant groups, LGBTQ groups, Asian, African-American or Latino groups, and against Jewish groups as well. And I do have a slide to show a little bit about historically what the ADL has done. Then also, and I think as my position as a community engagement manager in El Paso is the education part. The ADL has a long history of working closely alongside the FBA and other local law enforcement groups to help with professional development, help to understand the roots of hate, of understanding violent extremism, how to fortify faith-based organizations as well. In addition to that, the ADL has a very long history of working with local school districts, both private, public, and otherwise, to support anti-bias, anti-hate, and anti-Semitic training. One of the biggest programs is the No Place for Hate program. Currently, it's in Canutillo Independent School District, but we're hopeful over the next year, we'll be adding it to EPISD and other schools as well. The ADL, again, is a nationwide organization. This is one that's based throughout the United States. You can see in green over here, this is ADL Southwest, which is basically everything south of I-10 minus San Antonio and Austin, pretty much from Galveston all the way to El Paso. And so it was really important for the ADL to have a position here in El Paso. given that we're the crossroads of so many national conversations, and given to the fact that we also have been impacted by hate. And that brings me to the pyramid of hate. This is a really strong foundation of what the ADL understands. And that is, when we talk about acts like the Holocaust and genocide, history shows that genocide and acts of violence don't just start with the gas chambers, they start with biased attitudes. They start with the degradation of people, of conspiracy theories, of talking down about different minority groups. And that language leads towards a real world impact, right? We saw it with my own family in Europe during World War II. We saw it on August 3rd in 2019 in El Paso. We saw it in Poway. We've seen it in Pittsburgh. We've seen it in Buffalo, New York as well, that when people have biased attitudes and good people stay silent, violence often happens. And I think that one thing that the ADL focuses on in its current manifestation is understanding, again, that there's all different fingers off the same sand of hate. And what affects the Jewish community or affects the Asian community or the African-American community, the Latino community, affects all minority communities. And if we don't stand up for each other, nobody else will stand for us. And again, some of the pivotal moments that the ADL has been involved in, both in terms of policy and otherwise, was they were instrumental in the banning of masks in public places in southern states. This directly led to a dramatic drop in KKK membership. In 1954, the ADL led, along with others, an amicus brief in Brown versus Board of Education, which helped lead to desegregation of public schools across the United States. And then also in the 1980s, the ADL was involved with model hate crime legislation, which is extremely important for what we've seen as well. Lastly, again, understanding where we are as a country, data is something that drives a lot of decisions. It drives the decisions we have towards educational dollars, what we have towards policy and others. And the ADL is the leader in the entire United States of gathering data relating to hate crime incidents, anti-Semitic incidents, and other kind of bias attacks. Without that data, FBI and others are not able to have as robust of a response. And this, again, is some of the data from the 2022 audit. This is a collection of different data points that the ADL collects over the year to show what trends we're seeing in anti-Semitic and anti-hate attacks. And you can see here, for example, on the left side, just the last 10 years, the kind of dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents over the United States. And on your right, you'll see where some of those attacks are occurring. And that's just a little bit about what I'm doing here. Very fortunate to be working alongside the ADL with his position as a community engagement manager, very much a resource to El Paso, and very excited about serving El Paso in a different way as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Peter, for all of that information. And one of the things that you brought up, and I want to turn back to Jamie to start to answer this, is that not only are we seeing an increase in anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish hate speech and crimes, but we do have a history of that. But oftentimes people think the history of anti-Semitism began with the Holocaust. And unfortunately, it goes much further back than that. The Holocaust did not arise out of nowhere. And so, Jamie, can you talk a little bit about that and the education that you all do? How do you really situate the genocide that came from World War II?
Well, absolutely. I'm happy to talk on that because each anti-Semitic incident that we look at throughout history, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's the Tree of Life shooting, whether it's farther back into the Inquisition, the Crusades, these events cannot be seen in a vacuum. It's all about this connectivity to history and to today. And these roots run very deep. Anti-Semitism is often called the longest hatred. And exploring that history, understanding that context is really imperative to knowing what's happening today, to recognize the ongoing anti-Jewish sentiments, anti-Jewish tropes that we are seeing occur still today that have very ancient roots. So I'll take a quick overview of the timeline. It could take hours to go through the entire timeline of anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, it's vast and has many different incidents throughout our history, throughout humankind's history. But it is important to establish that timeline, because what we've seen as we study this is that despite the diversity of Jewish people, of Judaism as a religion, as a culture, as a heritage, anti-Semitism understands Jews as an unchanging negative force in the world and draws on a deep reservoir of lies, of propaganda, of hateful myths and conspiracy theories to support that faulty understanding, that faulty belief system. And much of what we understand about anti-Semitism, it takes root really the very early days in the rise of Christianity. And that was a catalyst for organized persecution of the Jewish people. And that separation, that othering of the Jews as a religious group, as a people, began so much with the church, unfortunately. And many of the myths and misconceptions that are still carried on today began with the church, particularly during the Middle Ages, when many people did not have much understanding of the world on their own, did not read, did not have an education. They followed what was taught to them by the church. And that really framed the thinking of the government all the way down to the layperson. And much of this can be traced back to the belief that belief in the crucifixion of Christ, that it was pinned on the Jewish people, not the Romans, as was actually the fact. But that trope, that myth of crucifixion has continued to carry forward into today and is still used by some to demonize the Jewish people, to target them. And it's a trope that was carried forward even into the Holocaust. And not to spend too much time on all of the details, but much of the propaganda that we still see today, much of the stereotypes did occur in the Middle Ages. The blood libel, the dehumanization, the caricatures that are still seen in propaganda today, which is just really dehumanizing, depicting Jewish people as the other, as someone with inhuman characteristics, horns and tails, and those with money and wealth, while others are without. Really the criminalization of a group of people with no justification, with no actual evidence to support it. But again, that's carried on throughout this history, and we see it again and again. And what we also see in this timeline of anti-Semitism is really rises and falls, where there are these large climactic events like the Crusades, which were forced expulsions, forced conversions, is similar to with the Spanish Inquisition, which is along the same lines. And then periods of time where there was emancipation of the Jewish people during the time of the Enlightenment, where Jews in Europe actually achieved great autonomy because, again, the thinking had shifted to being more of an emphasis on reasoning and equality other than on religion. And so we see that pendulum shift in that direction. And while that was a great time for assimilation, acculturation, Jewish achievements and contributions to society, it again shifts in the 18th and 19th centuries with the change in thinking, where emphasis becomes about race, about nationalism, xenophobia, and this emphasis on a racial hierarchy. And that again just shows the shifting of human thinking and philosophy and ideology. And that shift toward racial hierarchy, toward nationalization, anti-immigration, becomes the perfect breeding ground for the Holocaust, which we know was really the foundation. All of this long history of anti-Semitism becomes the foundation for Nazi ideology, to scapegoat the Jews for all of the issues happening in Germany, that convenient scapegoat that we see throughout history. And this need to, or this belief that in order to purify the nation, in order to purify Germany, they had to eliminate anyone who did not fit that ideology. This was not just in Germany, actually, this was really across Europe. This was happening in the United States. Eugenics movement actually happened here in the US first. Nationalism was on the rise across the board. Anti-immigration, xenophobia was everywhere. It just happened that Germany was that perfect spot at that perfect time, where there was economic collapse, the loss of World War I, a power vacuum left by a weak democracy, and in comes Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. So most people do think of the Holocaust. When they think anti-Semitism, they think the Holocaust. It began and ended with the Holocaust. And that was just one horrific and climactic event in a very long history that continued long after the Holocaust up into today, where we're seeing that resurgence of that type of thinking of anti-Semitism.
And Jamie, you're right. There's so many aspects to this issue. In some ways, it's extremely complicated. In other ways, it is back to what we see throughout history of one group othering and turning another group into less than human. And I know that this is something exactly that the ADL works on. And before I turn to you, Peter, I just want to say that if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature. And we will try to get to those. Also, if we have time, another sort of strand leading up to the Holocaust, there's an El Paso connection as well, very tragically, that we could talk about. But Peter, let me turn it to you to talk a little bit more about what Jamie has brought up.
Yeah, Jamie really brings up a lot of great points. And I think it's important to understand that anti-Semitism, historically and even today, it's like water in a vase. It kind of melds and shifts into whatever shape a society's concerns or fears are about. In the 20th century, you've had anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and thoughts that at one time was concerned about Jews being involved as being socialists or socialism, and then later in the century being arch capitalists and super capitalists that were out to crush people. Two completely different sources of economic strategies and government that Jews were blamed both on. And we see that shift in a sort of post-colonial sort of discussion and others that now has put Israel into that same sort of conversation with anti-Zionist rhetoric that again puts Jews into a different pedestal, that expects a double standard for the only Jewish state and others. We've also seen examples here too in Texas of different flyers that have simultaneously cast Jews as leaders of illegal immigration, of course, with George Soros taking the lead, of Disney and media control of Jews, and then also of Jews being responsible for LGBTQ issues and involvement as well. Again, there isn't a conspiracy theory or an issue that for anti-Semitism historically can't get blamed or pinned on Jewish people. And that I think is an important thing to understand historically, because while hate might come towards Jewish people, it doesn't end towards Jewish people. And when one group is attacked, it doesn't just end with them. And we've seen that in this country, especially over the last 5-7 years as well. So while anti-Semitism is absolutely at a rise, it also shows that it's against other groups as well. But what we're seeing here with anti-Semitism, the explosion has come from all parts, right? And people have blamed a variety of different ills and will unfortunately probably continue to still blame Jews for a variety of society's ills as well.
Yes, it's that connection to other groups that you also want, people want to have be dehumanized, discriminated against. And so once you move into the realm of anti-Semitism, then you can use that brush to taint another group. So yeah, it's fascinating how that works. Rabbi Zeidman, are these issues that you've seen in El Paso, or that you also would like to speak about some of the history of, certainly the history of the community here, people escaping anti-Semitism in other parts of the world to come to a place like El Paso?
Yeah, and Temple Mount Sinai has been a place where Jews have gathered, as I mentioned before, for, a long 125 years plus. And that's important if you want to create a space where Jews can feel welcome in a community, where Jews can identify as Jews. I mean, so much of the time when anti-Semitism is front and center and feeling really, prominent in our lives, we feel like we need to not mention, aspects of our identity in every space and every sphere of our day-to-day lives. So having that space where we can feel like we can be honoring and celebrating our tradition is vital to the continuity of the Jewish people. And synagogue life, Jewish, temple and synagogue life is the heart and soul of Jewish life for thousands of years now. So.
I want to talk for a minute. I know that we have a couple of questions, but I want to talk for a minute about the connection to El Paso and the Holocaust that I'm sure the panelists are familiar with. But if those of you in the audience aren't, I would really encourage you to read the book Ringside to a Revolution by David Romo. There's other material out there, but Zyklon B was first used in El Paso, Texas on migrant workers who were coming as part of the Bracero program to de-lice these migrant workers. And so they were stripped and they were covered in this poison, and it was studied by the Nazi Party. And then they began to use it first to de-lice the Jews who were coming into the concentration camps, and then ultimately as a more efficient way to conduct their genocide, to conduct the final solution. So Jamie's history, it's fascinating to learn more because unfortunately the United States one-drop racism rule targeted against slaves and former slaves, so that Blacks were seen as not fully human. The Nazi Party studied that as well, and even ultimately decided that that was too strict, that they were not going to go that far. So this history, we can't just pin it on other people. That it's too easy to make an evil guy, a straw man, evil man, because worldwide these issues have come up and continue to come up, and we all have to continue to learn about them and address them. But we have a question about DEI education in professional spaces. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes it's called diversity, equity, and belonging. And our participant is asking, why is anti-Semitism, or do you have thoughts about this, why it isn't often included in those professional spaces when that kind of work is being done? I don't know if any of you have a thought about that.
So the ADL offers a number of both about different programs in education, specifically for combating anti-Semitism in the workplace and others. In fact, I just was involved with a anti-bias facilitation training that discusses a lot of anti-bias, but also goes into understanding too what that bias looks like towards Jewish people as well. So there is those mechanisms and those programs that are out there as well, and would be more than happy to share my email with the audience and be able to share or connect if they have any further questions about that kind of information.
Great, thank you. I know sometimes anti-Semitism shows up in different ways. It's not always as obvious as the flyers that Peter shared earlier. And I know, things like microaggressions, sometimes the language that is used, sometimes there's slang terms that people don't even realize have an anti-Semitic history to them. Jamie, would you like to speak a little bit about this, of how microaggressions can come into anti-Semitic behavior?
Absolutely. We recently had an event on anti-Semitism at the museum, and in those discussions of planning the event, so many of our committee members, so many of our own members started voicing some of their experiences where maybe it hadn't received that attention before. They felt like, well, that's just kind of part of life, and they hadn't really voiced that before with us. And that was eye-opening in and of itself, that those microaggressions, those events that had happened to them that had been offensive and had been hurtful were really pushed aside as, let's not make waves, let's not draw too much attention, because it's not always given that same focus and that same that same attention as being just as hurtful. So some of those microaggressions that I've heard many times at the museum from our own people that I work with closely are really a lack of sensitivity to Jewish traditions, Jewish holidays, and the holy days that they observe, where there's, well, why don't you celebrate Christmas? Why don't you have a Christmas tree? Why do you need to observe this day? Like Yom Kippur or Passover, like what is that about? Is Passover the Jewish Easter? Is Hanukkah the Jewish Christmas? Things like that. Those are passive aggressive. Those are hurtful comments because it shows a real ignorance for what Judaism is about. And it shouldn't be on somebody else to have to explain their religious beliefs and their traditions over and over again. But other things that I've heard are said very offhand, very casually, things about being Jew down on a price. What does that even mean? And that I have heard from many of our members of our people that is just shocking to me that in this day and age, someone can still use the word Jew, which is an incredible, which is not a verb, not a negative or denigrating term in that sense, in that way. I think it's just one of so many examples that we've just come across. That even on tours of the museum, there is really such a lack of understanding, a great deal of ignorance as we go through the museum of what somebody who is Jewish should look like, what they should act like, what characteristics one should have. And it shows a lot of lack of understanding, a lot of ignorance. And I think that there's a long way to go to breaking through those microaggressions and recognizing that they are just as impactful, just as hurtful, and need to be addressed and need to be given that same light and same attention.
You know, as somebody who does diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and then I'm going to go to Rabbi Zeidman, what you're pointing out is so important. It's so important to recognize what becomes normal or the standard, and then what is seen as a deviation or weird, right? And so, and you can think of whatever group that is being discriminated against, you can think of ways in which this happens to them. Certainly your point about the calendar, you know, our American culture is organized around a Christian calendar. And so other religious traditions are not recognized and sometimes discriminated against for their own holidays. And so I really encourage, you know, think about what is put forward as the norm and question that, challenge that. Rabbi Zeidman, you had a comment.
Yeah, you know, I feel like it's obvious and it may not need to be said, but I just feel the need to say it, which is, you know, if you have an honest interest and curiosity, don't worry too much about, you know, asking. Right. I mean, if you want to understand, you know, and you have an interest in understanding and knowing more about what's going on with a holiday or what's going on with, you know, a belief or a tradition, it's not inherently offensive to ask, and don't keep yourself quiet just for fear of offending. You know, it's one thing to be ignorant. It's another thing to try to, you know, to learn and to grow from ignorance to knowledge and to greater experience. And some of the best conversations I've had have been because people have gathered up that courage to ask the honest question. And so I've been able to have you know, opportunities to share my own tradition and our practices and our faith with them. So, you know, the hope is not that we're going to scare people from engaging in conversations also, even if you don't know enough to ask the question well, there's some value in asking the question.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I know that I have taken lots of students to Temple Mount Sinai over the years, and the congregation there has been endlessly welcoming and happy to answer a lot of their questions. Peter, you had some thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, as somebody who grew up in El Paso in this small but vibrant Jewish community and left and came back, I mean, I think that it's important to, and it's hard sometimes because to be an ambassador for the religion and the people can be a little bit challenging, but I also think too, anytime to have an opportunity to engage and help to educate is an important one. With my time on city council, we were able to work with city management to have a menorah placed as part of the sort of holiday festivities alongside the Christmas tree and other holiday tree and other sort of festivities there as well. I think those parts are really important. The Jewish Federation, for example, has a menorah lighting every holiday season. That's an important cross-religious, cross-cultural opportunity. We all know that hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, come down to San Jacinto Plaza during the winter, and having the ability for El Pasoans or Juarensians to come and experience menorah lighting, perhaps the first time they've ever been in encountering a Jewish custom, is a great opportunity. Part of that too, it comes to each and every one of us, you know, to sort of speak out when we hear some of these microaggressions, right? And that comes down to not necessarily what the person who said the item feels about what they said in their intention, but rather how the person received it. During my time in council, there was a bit of a disagreement I had where some inappropriate language is used towards Gestapo tactics. It was important to speak out against that because it was also an opportunity, an educational opportunity to let people know what kind of language is inappropriate. And when you're talking about a public health crisis and the language that's there, it should never be equated with people like the Gestapo or Nazi Germany that was there to take away life, not to try to save life. It's important, I think, that we're able to have that space where people can ask those questions about that Rabbi Zeidman has sort of talked about, but also being able to create a space where we feel proud, whether it's as Jewish people or as Latino people, Asian Americans or others, to be able to speak proud about their own difference and their own culture and traditions as well. Because ultimately it's the differences that unite us. And we all sort of wake up, you know, maybe on the different side, but we all wake up, you know, with the sun rising, and we all go to sleep with the sun setting. And those differences in how we express ourselves is what makes us both unique and united as human beings.
I appreciate that, and I you know, it's important for those of us who are not Jewish to also respond when we hear those anti-Semitic comments, even if, again, as Jamie said, sometimes you're like, oh, I don't want to ruffle feathers, but you know, it's part of making anti-Semitism, racism, sexism, homophobia completely inappropriate and rare, right? Working against that. All of us have to work against that. Jamie, you've talked about the Holocaust Museum, and we have a question here about what are young people learning in school today? Are they still learning about the Holocaust? And or is it important do you see them surprised? And then also, who do you see at the museum? Is it mostly Jewish people, or is it mostly non-Jewish people?
Oh, those are great questions. So I'll start with education. And there's not really a blanket statement for what's happening in Holocaust education. It really is almost a case-by-case basis. Here in Texas, it is mandated to teach the history of the Holocaust. We have a Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission that helped put forward that mandate across Texas. And this is true in other states as well. However, how much you teach of the Holocaust is not mandated. So it really depends on the time, on the experience of the educator, the resources that they have, of how much education is actually put forward in the classroom. And unfortunately, what we know in Texas is that time is very limited, resources are very limited. I think this is probably across the board across the country, that teachers are not always given that time to really explore a topic as vast as the Holocaust. When someone is a history teacher, they're packing in 1,000 years of history in just one semester. So it's difficult to have that time, and it's a difficult topic to take on. So at the museum, that's something that we are always trying to assist teachers with. What are those resources that can be taken directly in the classroom? How can we unpack this in a way that it can be in a language arts classroom, in a psychology, in economics and geography? How can we really cross over those topics so that we can address the Holocaust in many different ways and through many different avenues? And in other places, Holocaust education is severely lacking because there is not access to resources. We're fortunate that we have a museum here where we have so many amazing resources in El Paso, in our state, but many places do not have that same kind of accessibility. So that's really an ongoing effort by Holocaust museums and education centers across the country, is how can we get this to our teachers to assist them, to give them all the tools that they need. And as far as the museum goes, by and large, the majority of our visitors are not Jewish. Probably about, I'd say 80% of our visitors are not Jewish. Many of them do not have a direct connection. They have maybe heard about the Holocaust, but oftentimes they come in with just a small understanding of what the Holocaust was. And so this is really often their introduction, particularly students. If a teacher is limited on time, this is the way that they can teach the Holocaust, is giving them a tour of the museum. And so it's a really interesting dynamic that we have, an interesting demographic that we reach out to, is how do we cross that that bridge into making it relevant to somebody, to a 12-year-old today who maybe doesn't have a direct connection, doesn't have that family history, but it does directly connect to them today. And so it's a really amazing challenge that we have, and a wonderful demographic in El Paso that we are so supported by both our Jewish and our non-Jewish communities.
Thank you. I know we're getting short on time. I have one more question for Rabbi Zeidman, and then I want a closing question that I want all three of you to respond to. But we've mentioned a few times the Tree of Life shooting, which was a very shocking anti-Semitic attack. 11 people were killed, 6 people were wounded. That included some Holocaust survivors who then lost their life in this violent act. And so, how do you care for your community at a time like this? And how did things change for you, or how did you get through that? And the trial for the shooter just began this week.
Well, we get through it the way a community gets through anything. The way our community gets through and continues to work its way through the events of August 3rd. We come together and we lean on one another. Right? One of the biggest things that I think that we can all be doing, to answer one of the questions that came in, and that I think we need to be thinking about as a group through these conversations, is, fighting hate is about coming together and understanding one another better, and building relationships with one another constantly across traditional boundaries and borders. It shouldn't be the case that we're reaching out to try to build relationships when we're in crisis. That's when the fabric, the deep, interwoven, deeply connected fabric can take the strain if we've been doing the work all the time, constantly. So, what happened immediately after the Tree of Life shooting? Well, we had a gathering downtown at San Jacinto, right, very purposefully. That needed to be a public space that is known as, right, our community gathering space here in El Paso. And the broad community showed up because we had deep relationships already. Friday night, the next Friday night for services, we had the Turkish Muslim community came to our service. We didn't invite them, we didn't ask them, we didn't, we had no wherewithal to even begin to think about that. And they just were there. They were there for us and with us. Front row, where most Jews don't sit. And they were there to be present with us. And that's what we can be doing constantly for one another, is we can be building those relationships so that we are able to then lean on them and be present with each other. That's the best thing that I think that we can really do, is better understand one another all the time.
Yeah, I love that, and be there for each other. I want to close with, and we have some questions that get to the same kind of topic. So this is Jewish American Heritage Month. But it's also been Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We are getting ready tomorrow to start Pride Month. Also in the month of June, we celebrate Juneteenth. And in fact, the YWCA is going to have a very large celebration, an inaugural celebration event with the Great Khalid Foundation. So if you want to go to ywcaelpaso.org and learn more about that, you should. But my point is, there's so many groups that we know are discriminated against. And Peter, I love the metaphor you used earlier. There's many different fingers in the sands of hate. And so the YWCA's mission is eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. How does that tie in with what we're talking about tonight, with the work you do? And what do we tell people? What can we do more of to bring our disparate groups together, to learn more about each other and to bring our groups together? So I'd love to have each of you talk a little bit about that mission, that work, and how you see it showing up in this realm.
Yeah, I'll
Peter, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think Rabbi Zeidman really sort of nailed it. It's about relationship building, and it's about being able to listen to others, understanding that we all have our prejudice or bias towards each other, but being able to listen towards each other with an open heart and open mind, with deep curiosity, right, towards the difference that are there, right? Understanding whether it's the Turkish raindrop house or others, they might pray to a different way. I was actually in part of a panel that Rabbi Zeidman had for the breaking of the fast with Ramadan with the Turkish drop house at Temple Mount Sinai, and it was amazing. It was a beautiful thing to sort of see how they prayed to break their fast during one of their most important holidays, and they did that within confines of Temple Mount Sinai, and then everybody was able to break bread together, to be able to break the fast and to learn about each other, because the way that Rabbi Zeidman and the congregation there had set up was different tables with facilitators there. But aside from that, I think really one of the most important things, most important takeaways from this, right? And like you said before, it's all different fingers off the same hand of hate that are there. It's that when we hear these kind of bigoted or conspiratorial or biased or hate or anti-Semitic sort of comments, it doesn't even have to be attacks, but when we hear about these kind of misinformed, ill-informed language, biased language, it's important that we speak out, right? It's important that good people don't stay silent, because what it takes is when there's a coworker, when there's a family friend, when there's somebody that we might see there, to have the courage and say to that person, what you said is inappropriate. What you said was wrong. What you said offends me, right? And that takes a little bit of courage. But we know that when we're not able to speak out against those smaller sort of attacks and aggressions, larger things occur. And we all have seen what occurs to communities, whether it's in El Paso or it's in Pittsburgh or it's, in Charlottesville or Buffalo, that, when good people stay silent, bad things happen. And so that is a big part towards this mission that the YWCA does such a great job on, is being able to learn from each other, being able to listen to each other, and being able to speak out for each other.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Jamie.
Well, just to add more to what Peter said, which was just really well put, very, very well put. So the way the museum sees it, the way the YWCA sees our missions, they're very similar, but it is because bias against one individual, against one community, whatever the reason, whether it is religious, whether it's racial, whether it's based on some other justification, that bias affects every single one of us. And in order to be that upstander, in order to really take a stand, you have to see your responsibility in that role. Whether it affects you directly, it may not. Maybe racism doesn't affect you. Maybe you have not felt the effects of sexism, but it indirectly affects you because you are part of this society and part of this world. And so we need to care about every act of discrimination, every act of injustice, because we are all part of this larger human story. And I always come back to what was said by a panelist at the last YWCA event I took part in. And he said, it's about recognizing the humanity in one another, seeing the humanity in each other. And it has really stuck with me ever since then, because that is really what it comes down to, is just seeing the person across from you just for who they are, not for anything else. And so I love that the YWCA really encompasses that with the work that they do in addressing all sorts of injustices and acts of inhumanity. It's what we strive to do at the museum as well. And And like Rabbi said, it's building those connections, it's building those relationships, and recognizing that we are all part of one community.
Thank you. Ben.
Ditto. I mean, you know, and supporting, by the way, these conversations and the YWCA and the other institutions like the museum and the ADL and those organizations that are, you know, that are really doing the work to ensure that El Paso and, you know, and the culture of El Paso is what we need it to be and what it has been and continues to be, you know, what to represent what's great about this region and about our area, and to, you know, to find those ways to continue to do the work and to support the people doing the work. So it's reminding people when you encounter them that who are dehumanizing or saying things that are you know, unhelpful and potentially then going to make things harder and harder and worse, and that's tearing down our culture and our tradition here, but also supporting and celebrating the people who are doing the great work like you all.
Thank you. I appreciate all three of you. And I just want to add, you know, education is absolutely key. And we live in a world where we have endless information at our fingertips. Not all of that information is good, though. So education, along with curiosity, with a discerning eye. I also want to add that sometimes groups that are discriminated against, they get into a competition about whose discrimination is the worst. And it's important to remember that that is the language of white supremacy, wanting groups to compete against each other. Whereas in fact, as Jamie was saying, we all have this shared humanity and we all have this need to reach out to each other so that all of us have a better life, not just in El Paso, which we all love, but you know, in our country and across our world. So there are resources that have been added to the chat. I encourage you to take advantage of them. I encourage you to visit the Holocaust Museum. Peter Svarzbein would be happy to come. I know he recently spoke to a Rotary Club here in town, would be happy to come to speak to any group about the Anti-Defamation League and the work. I know that Rabbi Zeidman would welcome anybody who would like to visit Temple Mount Sinai, because the way we combat stereotypes is by getting to know people that the stereotype is about. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said that Sunday morning is the most segregated time in the United States. And that sadly, statistics show that is still the case. Faith-based communities or other social groups tend to separate themselves from the people that they may not understand or may have some stereotype thinking about. So education and getting yourself out there is key. I appreciate those of you who took the time tonight to listen to this. We just brushed the surface of things, but I appreciate you coming, and we have an archive of previous courageous conversations on the YWCA website. Any last thoughts from any of our panelists before we go for the evening? Well, I will end by saying happy birthday to Peter. And thank you again for joining us, and hope to see a lot of you at the celebration of Juneteenth on June 17th, and at future YWCA Courageous Conversations and other events. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, YWCA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great night.